Matt. It's an honor to have you here. The floor is all yours. Please feel free to share your screen, introduce yourself, and start with your presentation.
Okay, all right, let's get this going here. So, should be seeing my screen here in just a second. Hopefully you're seeing PowerPoint, no slideshow. And now hopefully you're seeing the slideshow.
Yes.
Okay.
I can see it.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, so I would say because the way Teams is set up and stuff, I definitely want questions. I think the closer this is to kind of feeling like an in-person event, the more fun we're all gonna have. So keep the questions coming for sure, and I'll take some breaks in here to handle whatever we've got. Thanks for having me to this group. This is my first time here, so this is fun. Here are some ways to find me online if the slide will advance. Fun with, there we go. Okay. I am SQL at Speed pretty much everywhere online. So blog is SQLatspeed.com, Twitter, LinkedIn, GitHub, SQL at Speed, so on and so forth. I am not a consultant any longer, but I was for several years. So a lot of the stories actually in here kind of come from that. But I'm not trying to sell you anything now. I will say this, if we do have multiple openings, both for data engineers and software engineers, and our technology team is really something special. So if you're looking to kind of make the next career step, definitely reach out to me in any of these ways, and we'll get you hooked up with our hiring folks and all of that. That's the only kind of sales pitch that is going to be in here is I would like to work with you because we are growing quickly. A little bit more about me. The only really interesting part here is this last line. So obviously, with the demise of PaaS late last year, those of us in the Microsoft data community, it's been, for many reasons, a challenging year and a half or so. Thank you for being here. Thank you for staying involved, creating new groups. And I would just ask that you keep doing this. As we start to go back to in-person events in some places, every local user group, every data Saturday, every SQL Saturday, every online event always needs help. Moderation, feedback, organizing, marketing, who knows? So if you'd like to speak, that's awesome. But if you want to help in any other way, just stay involved. I've always said kind of the worst case of attending a data event is that you're going to learn something you didn't already know. The best case, and what has for sure happened to me, is you're going to make friends, you're going to meet people you didn't know, you're going to make networking connections that result in new jobs and raises and all that fun stuff. And I can honestly say the last 3 jobs I've had, I would not have had without being involved in my, data platform community stuff. So thanks for being here. Stay here. Stay involved. Like I said, I'm SQL at Speed everywhere online, and that is both a reminder to reach out to me with questions, comments, feedback, whatever, and also a really good excuse to show this slide. So the only thing I like talking about more than data is race cars. And I do get to drive once in a while. And actually the large picture there, the 5 car, I'll be in this weekend. So if you happen to be in Central Ohio, that's where I'll be. And I'd be happy to hang out and chat racing and all of those sorts of things. But that's not what we're here to do today. So let's talk about cloud migrations. And like I said, just a little bit of a backstory here. A couple things. First of all, this is the 3rd time I've given this session. You'll see it's actually branded from Data Platform Summit last year. I definitely invite any feedback. Obviously, with it being virtual, it's always hard because you don't get a read on the room and all that because we're all in different rooms. But any feedback, positive or negative, whatever, I always want this to be a little better the next time than it is. And so any feedback you've got at all, send it on. The joke I always say is, if you think it was great, tweet it. If you think it was bad, email me and don't tell anybody else. But whatever method you're most comfortable with, I want to know how this was. I'll also say nearly everything in here falls back on stories of projects that I've been a part of, whether I was leading them as a consultant, whether I was an internal resource, what have you. And I think what can make this talk better, even though in a virtual venue this is a bit hard, is any experiences that you can kind of bring to bear here. I would love to chat about those as well. It's very much through the prism of what I've seen. But if you think there's things that you've seen that would be handy, feel free to type those in the chat and we will talk about them. So, like I like to do with a lot of my tech talks, we're going to talk tech for most of this. But we're going to start the way a migration project I think should start, and that's not with technical items. We're going to talk about, and this kind of goes back to the title a bit, the moving mountains part is what we're going to lead off with, and kind of the organizational obstacles and things like that you can run into, the motivations behind doing this, which is where we're going to start. Whether you're an internal employee, consultant, whatever, this is important stuff to understand, and it's critical to your project being successful. And ultimately, that's what we want, right? We want to start a project and have it go well. So this non-tech stuff, we'll get to all the tech stuff and all the cool stuff in Azure that we can migrate to, and all the different ways we can do that. But I want to start with this baseline. Why are we in a project like this? Why has it started? So let's talk about a few motivating factors here. I don't know everybody's job role and things like that. I would assume we have a lot of data professional, maybe DBA and dev type folks. Probably not a lot of management, though I could be wrong. But a lot of times, obviously, these projects are steered by some sort of strategic vision or something, and they're coming down from a manager, from an executive, something like that. So let's talk about what a few of the migration motivations are and how they might influence some things that we do. Number one is saving money. And you have probably heard this either said to you or heard stories about it, where some sort of manager or executive type reads an article in a manager and executive type magazine, and it says, you move to Azure, Amazon, Google Cloud, whatever, and you save some fantastic percentage of money and everything's great. So they come to the data team, they come to you and say, we're going to move to the cloud and it's going to save us all this money. It's important to understand that that's what their motivation is. But there's another thing that's important to understand here, and we'll talk a little later about what these acronyms mean. So if you're not familiar with them, IaaS is infrastructure as a service, so basically VMs. PaaS is platform as a service. So if you've heard of like Azure SQL Database or Amazon RDS or something like that, that would be PaaS. IaaS is just going to be VM up in the cloud somewhere. But I'll make this point for the first of many times over the next 50 minutes or so. If the motivation is to save money, my experience, this is not a universal truth, but my experience has been, it is much easier to do that when moving to platform as a service offerings versus moving to VMs. So if your manager comes into the meeting and says, okay, we're going to take the 80 SQL Server VMs that we have, and we're going to migrate all of them to Azure, and magic, we're going to save money. It is best to dispel that notion up front, because odds are you will not. There are some things that you can do to maybe save money, but if you're just lifting and shifting what you've got on-prem to the cloud, and it's an exact duplicate because that's what they want, you're probably not going to save money. It's probably going to cost you money. And so it's important to know, and that's why this section exists. It's important to know what the motivations are, because the migration targets that we select, there's going to be technical reasons behind why we do that, but there's also going to be reasons like this. If a manager is motivated by one thing or the other, it's going to influence our decision as well. So that brings us to the second point. The motivation could be, and I've been involved in several projects like this, the company wants to close data centers, whether it's co-located with something else, whether it's building you own. Data centers are expensive. The people that run them tend to be expensive as well. And especially like I can think of clients over the years that were based in New York City or something like that. Real estate is phenomenally expensive. It can be worth spending a fair amount of money to get out of a data center because it's costing you so much. So whether you're consolidating all of the data centers down or decommissioning them entirely and heading off to the cloud at some future date, that can be a motivation. And it's important to understand if that's the motivation, because it may influence what your migration target choices are. Because it may be that time is of the essence there. Maybe I was in a project once where the building where one of their data centers was located was actually being sold and was not going to be a data center. So, where we would have maybe approached some things differently, given more time, we didn't really have that time, and speed mattered. And so, just get it out and get it into the cloud somewhere was the motivation there, and that's why it's important to understand this stuff up front. A third one, and I've seen these before as well. My boss told me I had to do it. So maybe you don't know the reason. And it's still good to engage in that conversation. Hey, are we trying to save money? Are we trying to get out of a data center? What are we doing here? But sometimes it really is just to tick a box. And we're I can think of a couple scenarios with teams I've worked with where the cloud migration focus, in all honesty, was the team got a bonus if they migrated stuff. And that's okay. And that's good to understand too. But again, it's going to influence some of the decisions we make, the speed at which we do them, the migration targets, all those sorts of things. So, again, if your boss comes in and says, we're going to migrate to the cloud in 6 months and leaves, it's still good to have that conversation with them and find out why, for all the reasons we've just kind of talked about. But sometimes the answer is just this. Well, I report to the CTO and the CTO said we're going to do it and we're going to do it in 6 months and everybody's getting a bonus. That is a valid reason. Maybe not the best reason, but it's a valid reason. Couple more things. So Microsoft did an interesting thing where if you were running SQL Server 2008 boxes, kind of the carrot they dangled is if you migrated those to the cloud, they extended your support, because 2008 long since out of support. They extended support if you're running it in Azure for, I believe, up to 3 years. So, that's awfully inviting. Obviously, they're trying to get your cloud business, but that can be a perfectly good motivation. And I've seen this a lot in healthcare. A lot of times, obviously, that industry being what it is, especially hospitals, things like that, incredibly risk averse. And I can think of stories where, we have worked on some applications and databases where the manufacturer of the software had been out of business a long time. And the last version of whatever their software was that was certified on an old version of SQL, like 2008. And the risk management people in the hospital don't want to move away from it because it's a certified version. Even though the vendor's gone, there's really no support for the application anymore. Risk management people tend to be very risk averse and they wanted to stay there. But if you're a nervous DBA, as I am known to be, I want as much support as I can get. So that could be a motivation, like, hey, we're going to actually put this stuff out in Azure because I want a higher level of support than what I'm getting right now. Last but not least, kind of going back to the point we just touched on at the end of the last slide, the motivation might just be, I want to go to the cloud. Just that's a thing we're going to do. We, whether it's marketing people saying we need to be cloud-based or cloud native or, whatever kind of buzzwordy phrase we've got, I just want to move. All this stuff that's on-prem needs to be in the cloud, and that's the only reason I have it. Just we need to modernize, and that's how we're going to do it. Oftentimes that will go hand in hand with, but we're not going to change anything. So this is the second time of the many times that I'll say this. Just lifting and shifting, while always valid, is not always the right choice technology-wise. And there are, especially if you're running like always-on availability groups or something like that, there are idiosyncrasies of building those in Azure where they are more complicated and may even cost a little more than what you're running on-prem because there's more bits that go into it. So if you're lifting and shifting, and it's one of these things where it's a time-based thing, or your boss just said, listen, in 6 months we're going to migrate to the cloud, but we're not changing anything, lift and shift at all. Have those conversations up front and set expectations. Make sure that everybody understands that just putting something in Azure or Amazon or whatever is not a magic way to save money. If your data center is super expensive, maybe it is a magic way to save money, but rarely is that the case. So take advantage of what the cloud platforms offer. We're going to spend a good bit of the rest of this time talking about that. Consolidate where you can. That's all ways to save money. Just moving what you got rarely does that. Any questions before we talk about some blockers? Okay. All right. So we've talked about what some of the motivations might be. And this kind of gets us into the moving mountains part of this. People are going to block our project for a variety of reasons. So let's talk about who those people are and what their reasons might be. Number one, and I say it because in my opinion is the single most important thing, you need the support of management to execute one of these. So one thing that I feel like is not always considered, and certainly I've been on projects where this is the case, cloud migrations extend beyond the data team. They involve operations, they involve networking, they probably involve security people, all those sorts of things. Generally, those are all going to roll up to a CIO, CTO, who knows what. The support of the management that's over all the teams is critical, because often what happens is we put the cart before the horse a bit. The data team gets down the road saying, we're going to migrate this to Azure SQL and we're going to migrate this to that. And it's going to be great. We don't have security buy-in. We don't have networking buy-in. We don't have operations or architecture buy-in. And it's because we don't have that management support. We've kind of gone down the road ourselves. And that is going to end in tears. It's not going to end well. So make sure that management is bought in, that everybody all the way up the org chart to a certain level supports this, funds it, prioritizes it, all those sorts of things. That is critical. And that kind of brings us to the second point here, is when you leave teams out, and I've particularly seen it, and call it what you will, operations, IT, whatever, you're always going to need them to do stuff, whether they're provisioning resources because of how your security stuff is set up, or they're changing network configurations or extending Active Directory out into Azure or something like that. You're going to need their help. And if you don't bring them along for the ride from the start, you're not going to get the quality of help you need because they feel like they were left out. So again, bring that in up front. That can be a management support thing. And this is also kind of where like a second sub point comes in here, is I mentioned the org chart, right? Make sure that all the managers and chief whatevers are bought in. Sometimes ignore what the org chart says. I can think of projects where, and this is where relationship building is key. And obviously in a mostly virtual world, that's tricky, but getting to know the people involved helps, because I can think of projects that I was on that we had the buy-in of everybody. You would look at the org chart and say, okay, everybody is on board who, reports up to this person. But you start to understand that there are people that make things happen in the organization that by the org chart doesn't seem like they would be involved. They just kind of make things go. Maybe none of these people report to them, but they've got the ear of this CTO or something like that, and they're going to kind of grease the wheels for you. So understand that too, and we'll come back to that point later as well. Who else might be standing in our way? Could be the dev team. So they're often, especially if obviously if you're moving all third-party apps, there's not going to be a development team that you probably have to worry about. But if it's home-built stuff, which is often the case, there is a development team that built that. They probably still work there. They may be resistant to this change. So that's a group you're going to want to include as well. And particularly, and we'll talk briefly about how the database migration assistant works and some of the kind of the code reviews and analysis that it does. It's going to call out breaking changes. Like, let's say you want to migrate to Azure SQL. It's going to tell you, well, this data type isn't supported, or whatever, you shouldn't do it this way. The development team may already be aware of a lot of that. And so kind of interviewing them at the start, they may not have to execute anything. It may be you and your team that does it. But you're going to want to have a chat with them about what you're considering and see if they're aware of any obstacles. If you don't do that, they are likely to be the obstacle at some point in time. So who else is standing in our way? And again, I put these slides together just thinking back over projects like this that I've been involved in over the years, including one that we're currently involved in. So who else is standing in our way? Back to the previous point, I'll kind of combine these two bullets here. If we don't bring the security group along for the ride and we haven't involved networking, they're going to stand in the way because we need their help. We're always going to need their help with this. If you have no cloud footprint, they are a critical component of what we're trying to do here. If you're already out in Azure, probably less so. We've got the network set up the way we want, probably AD authentication's right, and that those pathways are already built. A little less of a concern. You still want to keep them advised and involved. But if we're going into the cloud for the first time, they are a critical piece of this, and they will justifiably block the project if they're not involved in the right way. So this is one area where I would say over communicating is really key. You really want to make sure they're engaged, they know what you're doing, they know why, they know the timelines, and they're going to help smooth some things out for you. And I'll also say this. It's actually linked on my resources slide. Some organizations that I have consulted at, really none that I've worked at, the security group can be a bit old-fashioned when it comes to cloud stuff. And, kind of the bad rap, I would say the early days of, for instance, Azure had where, it's not secure. It's not in a building we own, so it's not secure. There's a link on my resources slide to all the security certifications that, for instance, any Microsoft data center carries. Odds are it's many more than any data center that you have. It's many more than any data center that I've ever worked in. But that can be a handy resource because I have definitely consulted places where the security group, like I said, was old-fashioned. And they're like, well, yeah, I know that technology wants to move to Azure, but it's not secure because of this thing I read 5 years ago. And it just isn't the case anymore. So that could be a nice thing to have in your back pocket and say, well, here's a list of security-related certifications that their data centers have. What does ours have? And that's a good way to kick that conversation off. Last but not least, the DBAs might stall on changes here as well. Particularly if you're new to the cloud or this is a new initiative. A lot of folks don't like change, and that's okay. Or they may, things look a little different. And we'll talk about like when you connect to an Azure SQL database, it looks a little different. It is SQL Server, but it doesn't, all the stuff isn't in the right place in Management Studio, and I don't have every option that I'm used to and all that. So that's where, kind of going back to this theme of kind of preparing the path, make sure people feel trained up on this stuff, that if they need to kind of upskill in this area, there's a lot of ways to do that. Certainly you could buy Pluralsight or LinkedIn Learning or whatever. There are paid training options. There's lots of free stuff out there too. Events like this, SQL Saturdays, Data Saturdays, Redgate's flavor of PaaS Summit this year will be completely free. And Microsoft has a whole workshop that's free that they've built called Ground to Cloud, which is basically, and that's linked on my resources slide as well. And that's basically a start to finish migration, and you're gonna feel a lot more comfortable working on cloud stuff when that's done. So make sure people are trained up, that they have access to those resources if they need it. And again, make sure that their management's bought in too. So you may have a DBA who kind of slow walks everything because they don't want to do this. But if the person who signs their paycheck says they have to do it, eventually they're going to come along. We just want to kind of make it as easy as possible, make sure everybody's as comfortable as they can be getting into this new stuff. So let's kind of put a bow on this part a bit. There's a couple points I want to call out, and some of these, like this slide is talking about working on a migration as an outside consultant, which I did several times. The next one talks about executing as an internal full-time employee, which I've done too, and am doing right now, actually. Get a good sense, as good a sense as you can get, whether you're in person, virtual, whatever. Build relationships at the client. Make sure you get the organizational politics that are at play here. Know who's supposed to be in charge. Like I said, know what the org chart says, but also know the people that probably are in charge. And sometimes that's outside of what the org chart says. But all that knowledge and building those relationships is always going to help you at some point. Understand the competing interests of the different group. And I've seen this a lot, especially in larger firms. The data team may be highly motivated to move everything to Azure because of who knows what, whatever the reason is. But it maybe data reports up through a different part of the organization than security does or than networking does. And their priorities on that team may be completely different from the data team. Understand that, and that's where that management buy-in, not just the people over data, but the people over all these different teams, make sure we're all rowing the boat the same way at the same speed, and don't try to kind of bully the other teams into getting what you want, because it's not going to go smoothly. But it's, as an outside consultant, you don't want to be the one elbowing people into doing stuff. You want to make sure kind of that their management is doing the dirty work for you. And last but not least here, learn where the centers of power are. Like I said, learn who should be in charge, learn who is in charge, build relationships there, get them bought in, and your project's going to be a lot more successful. If you're a full-time employee, politics may be less of a concern. You're going to know the organization better. You're probably going to have a really good understanding of, well, yeah, we report to this person, but actually this other person is kind of who knocks obstacles out of the way for us. So you're going to have that kind of inherent knowledge, whereas an outside consultant, you probably will. You still want to be aware of all those things. You're going to know how to work your way kind of up and down the org chart to get stuff done. But another reason I would encourage you to kind of stay plugged into this is you hear a lot of talk about soft skills, whether you're a consultant, whether you're a speaker, whether you're brand new to data, whatever. A project like this helps you build those soft skills and build relationships across the organization, and that's going to pay off for you just as kind of general career advice. Positioning yourself as an authority and somebody kind of directing a project like this is going to be really good for you. You're going to learn a lot, and build a session like this and have it be way better than mine. So before we talk about migration targets and spend the second half of this all in tech stuff, are there any questions? I will take that as a no. All right, so let's dive into the nerd stuff. So I mentioned briefly IaaS and PaaS earlier. I like to show this diagram. It's a little less fun than the pizza one that you may have seen, but I think this gets the point across really well. So on premises, which in theory we've all worked in at some point, as the chart here says, we manage everything. It's we or somebody that works with us has racked the server, cabled it, cooled it, all those sorts of things. We manage the entire thing. And that's why it shows that whole stack. We own it. Infrastructure as a service is, again, we're basically working on VMs. So you see that what's grayed out, like it stops at the virtualization layer. We're not managing that, but we're managing everything above it. We're installing operating systems, middleware if it's involved, applications, data. We're supporting all of that. Platform as a service, we're supporting only data and apps. And so that's where, and I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about targets like this, Azure SQL Database, managed instance, things like that. It's easier for DBAs. Don't believe the hype. Platform as a service stuff does not mean the DBA's job goes away, but it does change because we're not having to support a lot of the stuff we do now. We're not patching and we're probably not actively administering backups and things like that. We're doing tuning and optimization and those sorts of things. Platform as a service for me is where the real value of the cloud comes in. It's possible to save a good bit of money if you've deployed the right things in the right way. We've also got software as a service here. Not really germane to our talk here, but does kind of fill out the slides so you get an idea of the whole thing. So let's talk about some migration targets and where can we land this stuff. And I'm going to kind of work my way from what I think is probably most common, most comfortable for everybody, into kind of the more advanced and not necessarily off the wall, but things you see less and less. But I want you to be aware of, at least in Azure, every target that's available to you so you can make the right technical choice. First things first, SQL Server on an IaaS VM is perfectly valid place. So, and going back to what I mentioned earlier, where I've done these, I've kind of worked with a couple of teams where basically they're like, well, our motivation is we get a bonus if we can show our boss a server and say it's in the cloud. We all get $1,000 or whatever. So this is the way to do that. Odds are, if we've worked on boxes on-prem, a lot of us probably have VMs on-prem as well. The only difference is with this, the VM is in a Microsoft data center and not one that we own or not one that we pay for. Lifting and shifting here is easy. You could use something like Azure Migrate to do it. You could also, build an Azure VM yourself, install a SQL Server, restore a backup. This migration path is going to be probably the most comfortable for all of us, but it may not be the right choice for you for the reasons we've already talked about. Odds are running an equivalent machine in Azure is probably going to cost you a little more than it is on-prem, depending on what your arrangement is. So if your boss has said, we're going to go to the cloud and save a bunch of money, you don't necessarily want to recommend this. You're also not taking advantage of the cool stuff that the cloud does, that all the platform as a service offerings do. So, lifting and shifting is easy, may get us our bonus, but it may not be the right thing for the company. Which ultimately probably then is not the right thing for us, because then when the manager comes to you in 6 months and says, why does our cost center cost more now? So, well, boss, we moved everything to Azure, but we didn't consolidate anything, and we put it all on VMs that are a little expensive, and you don't get a bonus because you spent too much money trying to do this stuff. So I say all that to say this. Did we choose this because it's a comfortable target for us? It's easy, like I just talked about. Or are there technical reasons why we did this? Is there something maybe that platform as a service doesn't support in the way we need? We'll talk about what a few of those gotchas are in a few slides. Did we choose it for comfort, for speed, or because it's the right technical solution for us? And that goes back to understanding what the motivation for the project is and making the right technical decision based on that. So we talked about SQL Server on a VM, probably somewhere we're all very comfortable. Let's get into Azure SQL Database. I will caution you something here. I call this single because it is the way I like to talk about it. It is branding that Microsoft moved away from. If there's a Microsoft person attending, they're going to see that and shake their head and say it's not called that anymore. And indeed, it's not, but it's a way I like to think of it because it contrasts itself with what an elastic pool is. So don't call it this. It's not supposed to be called that, but it does help me understand it. So what these are, they're SQL Server databases. It's very similar to Box product, except Azure is going to get stuff. Obviously there's not a vNext every month or so on-prem. So Azure is going to get stuff a little ahead of where the Box product is. But this single database, fully managed, like we said, this is a platform as a service offering. So it's doing backups and patches and all that. That's happening for you. There are some switches you can throw to set windows for when it gets patched and how long you keep the backups and some of that kind of stuff, but it's all being handled for you. You're not having to build any jobs to do any of this. These databases are isolated from each other by a logical server. So you're basically creating a server, you're creating a name, and that's where you've seen, blah, 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 .database.windows.net. That's the logical server. And then databases exist there and you can do stuff with them. Just because this was called single, you can certainly have more than one database on a logical server, but they exist as kind of independent things. Where an elastic pool comes in is a collection of those that kind of travel together. So you have those on a logical server. They're given a shared set of resources, so much CPU, so much memory. We'll talk about it in a couple slides, kind of how the stuff's priced out. Not the pricing per se, but how we buy it, and kind of what those units are. And an elastic pool is just, I support all of the databases with this set of resources, and so they exist together in that way. Last but not least, managed instance is another Azure SQL flavor. It's different, and so I've got a couple slides. I want to call it out here, but I actually have a couple slides later that go into detail on it. So let's talk a little bit more about Azure SQL Database non-managed instance, and then we'll come to that. So Azure SQL DB, the TSQL support. So one of, and I would say it got a bad rap early. It was fair. The TSQL support, it didn't support everything right out of the box, years and years ago. And unfortunately, that impression is kind of carried forward with some people where they're like, well, we can't use Azure SQL because it's not really SQL Server because it doesn't support all this stuff. Maybe that was true years and years ago. It's no longer true. So the TSQL support is basically equivalent to what you've got in the box product now. There obviously are the things you can't do. It doesn't support the commands for that because it's doing those for you, but the TSQL support's pretty much the same. The two things that Azure SQL Database non-MI doesn't have is it does not support cross-database queries. So, I see these a lot in kind of legacy applications, but where you're querying a server with like a 4-part name and trying to hit a database that way, it doesn't support that. There are kind of workarounds for it, but if your code contains that, you would have to change your code to run it in Azure SQL. And there's no SQL Server agent. So if you have a ton of agent jobs, then you might want to look at something like Managed Instance, which does support that. There are different ways to schedule and automate things within Azure, but Azure SQL does not support the agent that we all know and maybe love. There are kind of two classes of service tiers. So basic, standard, and GP, they separate compute and storage, an SLA of 4 nines, which is pretty solid, and again, likely superior to what you're offering in your current environment. I don't guarantee that, but it's strong. Premium and business critical, as the name implies, you're expecting a higher level of service there. It co-locates compute and storage because you're probably expecting a higher level of performance, and it offers that as well. The higher service tiers, and this is going back to this point where I've talked about, like, let's think about the structure of what we're doing and use that to kind of save money where we can. The higher service tiers here, if you go and read the architecture document on the Microsoft Docs site, what you're going to realize is these higher service tiers are essentially always on availability groups under the covers. So if your boss has come to you and say, okay, we have these 24 node AGs that we run, and we're going to move all those to Azure, and we're going to set up 20 AGs in Azure because I want to lift and shift because it's what I know. Don't. Strongly recommend one of these and walk through that architecture doc, and that's on my resources slide as well. It is an availability group, but you don't have to manage it. You don't have to worry about the clustering. You're not managing the failover and things like that. You can set up like zone redundancy and some of those sorts of things, but it's a switch or a checkbox as you're building this out. I'm not managing the network part of the failover and cluster, and it works. So you're getting all the benefits of an AG with none of the managing. So strongly recommend that. If you're coming from like an availability group or an FCI environment and you're looking for that level of, in theory, zero downtime, look at some of the higher service tiers of Azure SQL because architecturally you're getting everything you want. You're not having to deal with most of it. But I said we'd talk a little bit about how these things are costed out. Here's that slide. So again, not going to get into pricing. With Azure, that's fluid, and depending on the size of your organization, the mood of your sales rep, all those sorts of things, the pricing can be fluid here. But you pay for Azure SQL in one of two ways. There's a DTU-based purchasing model. And again, the link there takes you right to a docs page that does kind of describe in some detail what a DTU is. My favorite way to do this is the second link there. So what is a DTU? Was written by a fellow MVP, Andy Mallon. It's on Twitter at AMTWO. It is the best article I have ever read basically trying to put together from like a DBA perspective how a DTU is calculated. Like, what is it? Super great article, tons of good information. Andy's got a really kind of conversational style to his writing. So definitely recommend that if you want to understand what a DTU is. vCore based model. So both exist. And actually there's a couple links on my resources slide to some videos I did for Channel 9 last fall in the Data Exposed series, going into more detail here than we've got time for. But vCore is kind of the other way that you can buy this stuff. And you'll see the different service tiers support, different models, and the portal has that laid out reasonably well, where like DTU based purchasing is this tab, vCore based purchasing is this tab. The one bit of advice I'll kind of dole out here is that it seems to me when talking to management type folks, they're more comfortable buying or using the tiers that have the vCore based purchasing model. I think because it reminds them of how you buy it on-prem, where you're buying 2 core packs. So it's a terminology thing. Both purchasing models do exist and will exist. So there's no right or wrong. And again, all the details are there. This is not the super exciting part of this talk, but it is important to understand kind of the units you consume this in. So we've kind of gone over like the basics of some of the normal service tiers, where probably we're going to land a lot of this stuff just depending on what you need. How much performance do you need? The more DTUs, the more vCores, the more horsepower you have. And those tiers kind of all have that in common. But there's a couple kind of special tiers that I want to call out. So Azure SQL Database Hyperscale fixes a problem or a gap in the Azure SQL offerings that existed. So you've probably heard people say, well, if you're going to Azure SQL and your database is bigger than 4 terabytes, it doesn't work. That was pretty much true. There were some creative ways around that, but it was pretty much true. If you're in a large on-prem environment, let's say you've got a database that's 20 terabytes, you didn't really have a good place to put it in the Azure SQL family. Hyperscale, you do now. So it looks just like Azure SQL. If you provision one of these, you're going to notice your bill is higher. But if you connect to it, it looks just like Azure SQL. It's not really going to call itself out. But they've changed the way the storage technology works under Hyperscale as compared to the different tiers. And that gives us not only some really cool performance things I'll talk about on the next slide, but a capacity of up to 100 terabytes, which is satisfactory for nearly every customer I've ever had. So it does give us more flexibility to migrate large databases than we had before. As is similar to all these platform as a service offerings, the resiliency is provided at the storage level. So a lot of the high availability stuff is built in. And you'll see 2 slides from now, the architecture of this is different than the Azure SQL stuff we just talked about. And so it does have a compute, kind of like the concept of a head node. So for true HA, you're going to want to provision at least 2 of those, so it has somewhere to fail over to. But the HA at the storage level is certainly built in. So like we said, supports up to 100 terabytes. That's going to be good enough for most of us. What's really exciting is, and having to manage some large databases on-prem in my environment now, backups and restores are painful. They take a long time. It's a drag on the machine as we're doing them. Because of the way Hyperscale is architected, it's file snapshots stored in Azure Blob Storage. So we're not impacting any of the computers we're on by doing backups, and the restores work the same way. So not only is it much faster, it's really, really cool, which is nice and goes super, super quick. It does have, like I said, higher overall performance. So depending on blogs you read and things like that, if you hear about log throughput caps in Azure SQL, Hyperscale has a much higher ceiling for some of those. And the transaction commit times are faster as well, even as the volume expands. And it's because the architecture under the covers is very different. It also allows you to rapidly scale out and scale up. So again, one of the cool things about the cloud is if we're trying to scale on-prem, it may be that we have to go buy hardware to do that, and that's not going to happen in an hour or two. But in the cloud, we can just kind of pull that slider and say, I want more of this, I want more of these. And as long as we can pay, then we're going to have all that. What are some limits? So I do think Hyperscale is cool. Couple things I do want to call out. Elastic pools are not supported within Hyperscale. And if you're talking to the people who are going to review your Azure bill, it bills compute and storage separately. It can look like two different line items for the same thing when it isn't. So that's kind of a call out where your accounting people might have some questions because it's really billed as two separate things. But I said we were going to have a look at how it looks. Let's do that now. So I'll quickly go through this. I'm not going to read a picture to you because that wouldn't be a lot of fun. Those compute notes where I said you need to provision at least 2 to have like true HA here. You can see this diagram actually shows 3, and it's showing in the green kind of the path of the read-write stuff. So that's, if you're familiar with AG terminology, your primary replica basically is doing the read-write stuff. The secondaries, as they're labeled here, is doing the read-only stuff. And you can see where, we don't just have data files and log files here. We've got a log service, and we have a couple different tiers of storage there. Long-term logs for point-in-time restores are on standard storage, costs a little less. But then the landing zone itself is on premium storage, costs a little more, but we want that performance right then. We also have the concept of page servers, and the data files live there. And you could probably do an hour just on this slide, but I'm probably not smart enough to do that. So let's move on to the next slide. If you've heard about serverless, I think the name is dumb. There are servers involved here, but the marketing people, I think, love to call it, Amazon's got a serverless thing, so Microsoft needs one too. So we have Azure SQL Database serverless. We've got, so basically, in layman's terms, what we've got here is kind of like a pool of warm VMs, let's say. So they're not provisioned for us, but as we scale up, so serverless is flexible, and I'll get into the settings and the influence it has on that. But for bursty workloads, let's say we just have 2 machines most of the time and that handles it, but we sell stuff that, the holiday for that stuff is coming up. We're going to do 80% of our business in the next 2 days. We can go from having 2 machines to 80 like that, roughly. It takes about a minute. But then when that business then scales back down, we're not doing that stuff anymore. It will put those machines back in the pool. So they're not ours anymore. But so you get serverless, you get the capacity increase. But like I said, it can take 60-ish seconds or so to pull those kind of VMs out of the pool and say, okay, you come over here and handle this workload now. It's not instantaneous to the second, but it's around a minute. So what are the configuration settings that govern how this works? So we're working in vCores here, so we can set a minimum. So like I said, if our e-commerce site doesn't need much horsepower most of the year, you set your min vCores. They can go as low as 2. You say, I'm just going to have 2, and it can handle my workload. You do want to set a max, so cost containment in the cloud, big deal. That matters very much here. If you set the max to 80 and the workload justifies it, it will pull 80 vCores of horsepower in and use them. But if you really don't need that amount of speed, set the maximum a lot less. And then the auto pause delay is basically what it is it's analyzing your workload, and it will start to give the machines back and kind of scale down. And that's governed by the auto pause delay that you've set. So it's like, basically, if things have been quiet for a few minutes, go ahead and give those back. Or if you want it to be an hour or something like that, you're just telling it when to give the machines back as it sees that workload has started to tail off. I did mention it's not the most responsive on scaling. You're going to be looking at around a minute there. It is billed to the second. This is another one of those things where the accounting people are going to look at this weird because it's billed by time. And again, as you might think, it's best for those bursty workloads that, I need to do a whole bunch really fast, but most of the time things are just going to sit around. Managed instance, I said we'd come back to it, and here we are. It is more or less On-Prem Enterprise Edition, and you're paying for that too. Managed instances are not cheap. It is a platform as a service thing, so we're getting the automatic patching, even though it looks like we're connecting to a machine. It looks like if you connect to it in Management Studio, it looks just like we've connected to a VM, basically. We're getting automatic patching. We're getting automatic version updates. We're getting automated backups. We're getting high availability under the covers. You know, again, it's a lot like an availability group. We just don't have to do any of the stuff. There are a few interesting ways to migrate to this. So Azure DMS, Data Migration Service, is one way. Here in a couple slides, I'm going to talk about some more ways. But if you're really looking for, I want a cloud experience that matches what I have on-prem, but I want it to be platform as a service, managed instance is going to look just like a SQL Server. And in fact, I've had customers over the years where the DBAs chose managed instance to land their cloud stuff because of that comfort level. Wasn't the cheapest, but that's kind of where they wanted to be because it looked familiar to them. The one gotcha here is, so I said once you're connected, it looks just like one. Connecting to it's a little different. So there's 3 different ways to do it. There's a secure public endpoint. So if you just have apps that are connecting to it, that's going to be the way you're going to want to go there. Site-to-site VPNs like Azure Express Route or something like that. You can VPN into it, and you're going to access those, you know, from different virtual networks in your Azure infrastructure. That's where we've got to be friendly with the networking and operations folks. They're going to help us do this. And in most organizations, we can't even do this. The DBAs don't own this kind of stuff. The third way is actually a jump box. So it would be an Azure VM. As long as it's on the same virtual network as the managed instance itself, you RDP into the VM, and then you can connect straight to the managed instance from there. So I would argue some enhanced security here, but it does complicate a little bit how you connect to those. Any questions? We got about 10 minutes left here.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
First question: Can you do mix match? Is it possible when you're moving to the cloud, Eddie? Also, can you mix match infrastructure as a service and platform as a service together?
Yeah. And most of the projects I'm on, we've done some combination of that. Just, you know, it could be the way the database is, or like I said, some, you know, maybe an older application doesn't want to connect to managed instance in the ways I just talked about. And so you would stand up a VM and put that there. It's all perfectly valid.
Thank you.
Sure thing. All right, so let's talk some migration methods here. So these are in no particular order, but what I kind of want to emphasize is there's a lot of different ways to do this. So how can we migrate stuff? Obviously, if we're moving to a VM, we can take a backup. We can copy it up to the VM. We can restore it there. That's valid. What I'm looking for is almost kind of an on-the-fly thing. Like, how can we do this more real time and have that notion of, you know, I've cut over to the cloud. Replication is one way to do that. So Azure SQL Database can be a replication subscriber. You can set up replication to SQL Server on Azure VM as well, just like any other SQL Server box. Perfectly valid. Replication is not sexy. It's not always great, but it's there. And a lot of us know how to use it, know how to support it and set it up and all that stuff. So it's a valid method here. We can set up log shipping to a SQL Server box on an Azure VM as well. That can be nice and clean, fairly straightforward, not a lot of moving parts there. We can, and in the 75-minute version of this talk, I actually show this. We can right-click on a database in Management Studio and make a DAC pack out of it and tell it, hey, migrate this to Azure. Don't do that on databases that are very big, but you can actually demo that and see it. And with smaller databases, it works. You could do a bulk load to a managed instance. I don't know that I would recommend that, but I want to talk about every method that's possible here. What are some more complicated ones? Or kind of some, we're building off complicated infrastructure here. So we can, if we have availability groups, we can put a replica out in Azure and scale the availability group out into Azure and then fail over RAG to the Azure replica. And we're in the cloud now. That I helped a customer with that a couple times, and that's certainly a valid way to do it. I wouldn't stand up availability groups just to do that, but if you're already using them and your team's already comfortable with them, perfectly fine. We mentioned Azure Migrate briefly. The migration tooling in Azure has undergone a lot of evolution. Azure Migrate is really kind of all of that in theory under one umbrella. We can migrate database servers and app servers and web servers and all that stuff. It's going to largely use Azure DMS under the covers to do that. And that's the database migration service. And that's basically, I select a source database, I select a target, I hit a bunch of buttons, and it's going to move. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Last but not least, so they have this relatively recent notion of the log replay service, LRS. That is essentially log shipping to a managed instance. If you need, if you don't have permission for much downtime as you do this cloud migration, like let's say you've got a weekend that you just have to cut over and you don't have a day, you've got 10 minutes or something like that, using the LRS to get data up to your managed instance. So it's not supported for normal Azure SQL, but it is supported for Azure SQL MI. That gives you the ability to basically cut over like that. And again, setting up log shipping is pretty straightforward and not too bad to do. And there's great documentation on that going back years and years. So what do I think about this stuff? Again, Azure Migrate, if this is a fairly large project where we're moving whole chunks of the enterprise up into the cloud, you're probably going to be working with your Azure, or with your infrastructure and networking folks. And they're going to be using Azure Migrate. And they're going to want you to do the database servers that same way. Microsoft says it's a unified approach of individual tools. Your mileage may vary here, but if you're moving a lot of different servers, that's how you're doing this. We just talked about what the LRS was. A little more detail here. So it only supports SQL Server 2008 and up. So if you have 2000 or 2005, you're out of luck to use this. It's basically taking full backups, differential backups, and log backups. You have to have checksum enabled on those. So if you're doing this manually, there's an auto magic flavor of it. If you're doing it manually, you have to have that set up. It is landing these in an Azure Blob Storage container. And so like I said, there's an autocomplete mode where it basically, once it migrates everything, it kind of cuts it over for you. There's also continuous mode where if you want that manual control of when the cutover happens, continuous mode is the mode that you're going to run that in. Here in the 75-minute version of this would be demos of the data migration assistant, deploying to Azure via Management Studio, which we talked about earlier, and migrating using Azure DMS. To be honest, these demos are fairly dry. And so I think the hour version of this talk, we're not really losing a lot other than seeing me click some buttons and data moves. But they all function in very similar ways. One thing I did want to call out here is that for Azure DMS, this is another part where the networking folks do need to be involved. Several ports have to be open for DMS to work. Port 443, port 53, and I've got a list over here on the second screen of probably 8 to 10 other ones. You need your networking people for a cloud migration. You absolutely need them. So be nice to them, give them gifts, feed them, and they will take care of you because you're going to need their help here. So what did we learn? Just a couple of quick things as we wrap up. Takeaways. Understand how licensing is handled. So maybe we're not governing it, maybe we're not paying for it, but it can be a real benefit to your project. And I've obviously focused on Azure here. And the reason behind that is this. Microsoft offers what's called the Azure Hybrid benefit. And as the maker of SQL Server and the owner of Azure, they can do this. And it's kind of a direct shot at Amazon. It's heavy, heavy discounts if you're migrating an on-prem workload to Azure. Amazon can't offer that because they don't make SQL Server. Get your licensing people involved or take the helm of that yourself. We're talking, it could be like 50 to 80% savings, depending on what you're moving, how much of it there is, and all that. I'm not a consultant anymore, but I would say this is where having a consulting partner, especially for a project of any decent size, can be a real benefit to you because they have people that understand this stuff that are going to get you plugged in all the right way. Make sure the DBAs and devs understand what we're doing here, that we've migrated stuff that connection settings have changed, that they know how to connect to the new stuff, that we're communicating over and over again when things move, how to connect to the new stuff, cut over days, all those sorts of things. Your maintenance procedures are going to change here as well. So depending on the chosen target, the platform as a service stuff is doing some of that maintenance for you. So you're going to change, you're not doing backups and things like that. So you may change the way you look after indexes and take advantage of what it does for you and kind of the maintenance windows that it opens up for you. I've said it over and over again, lift and shift isn't always the right choice here. We've talked about why that is. It can often be expensive. We're often choosing it for a level of comfort instead of it being the right technical solution for us. And going back to the very start, if the motivation is to save money, lift and shift is almost never the right choice because it's almost always a little more expensive than the way you're running it now. And that underscores this, like we have to know what the motivation is. Why are we migrating stuff? Is it to save money? Is it to get out of a data center that's the building's being sold or it's too expensive or any of those sorts of things? Because the technical target, all that stuff we just spent the last half hour talking about, that target decision is going to be different depending on what the motivation is. And that's why I cover it up front. And kind of last but not least, knowing the organizational politics, whether we're an employee, a consultant, some blend thereof, moving those mountains out of the way, getting everybody doing what they need to be doing here. That knowledge of organizational politics, personalities, relationship building, all those sorts of things is going to be just as important to the success of your project as any of the technical stuff we talked about as well. Here is my resources slide, and do let me know how I can get these slides over to you and folks can click through these links and all that. Thank you so much for having me. I think I brought it in mostly on time, and these are all the different ways to find me. Feel free to reach out, questions, concerns, comments, feedback, all those things. But with that, I am done.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
If you guys have any questions, feel free to raise your hand.